Hello, my name is Olurotimiyosha. Today is April the 6th, 2026. I'm continuing with my discussion on the blowback to the insane tweets by President Trump, in which he used expletives such as effing open the Strait of Hormuz and they called Iranians crazy bastard, and then in the same sentence he goes, uh, praise be to Allah, on all of this yesterday on Easter Sunday. Um, so what is astonishing is that it all suddenly became too much um, for Republicans, right? A lot of Republican talking heads like uh, Marjorie Taylor Greene, a former congressman, she went outright and called President Trump mad, insane. Candace Owens called Trump insane. Uh, and it's bizarre that with all their pearl clutching, it's kind of bizarre that his first term, right, the instigating of January 6th, all the things that had preceded, uh, never quite seemed beyond the pale to these Republican talking heads now. And I'm using this as some kind of teachable moment regarding America's romanticization of madness, of insanity. I've done in the earlier video I did. I already discussed how insanity is not really a medical term anymore. It's considered a pejorative. Although insanity is still used as a legal term, which shows some kind of conflict, right? Some kind of contradiction, because insanity is still a legal term in our courts, and of course the courts will send, uh, you know, um, defendants to a psychiatrist. By the way, many of these psychiatrists, um, struggle with mental illness today or mental disorder. Uh, I used to be a pre-med student at Columbia, and I noticed, when they asked people, why are they interested in the field of the specific field of medicine? Why do they want to do medicine? Many of the people who had struggled with mental illness wanted to do psychiatry. Many of the people who wanted to go and be psychiatrists often said, they invariably said, it's because they either had struggled with mental illness themselves, or someone close to them, a loved one, struggled with mental illness and they wanted to understand it. I personally am not interested with morbid stuff or pathology. So I come from a culture which, unfortunately, though, I don't know good or bad, but my culture, yes, it does stigmatize um, to what you call mental illness today in America. It's called madness. They just call it madness, and they ostracize from the rest of society. They don't go to school. They do not marry. They're basically, separated from society. If people are wealthy enough, they can keep them in their house and they don't interact with other people, right? Of course, those such conditions would be extreme cases, which would mean that milder stuff, with the change in nomenclature, medical nomenclature in America today, it means a severe form of mental disorders, right? Easily with, and they're packed within the same umbrella of mild mental illness, right? So anxiety, for instance, is clearly not what used to be insanity. Even though people who would be called insane could display anxiety or depression, right? Acute depression and things like that. There's the tendency to conflate mild forms, and they just put everything under one huge umbrella today. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not interested in those things. But it's just an observation. As I said, Americans have a tendency to romanticize madness, crazy. You see in our art, in our music. I remember, growing up, many artists would sing songs about being crazy, right? I'm crazy for you. Crazy is used as a synonym for love, intense love. You got me going crazy. I'm not a musician, but if anybody can remember the boys, they sang that song, You Got Me Going Crazy. So again, Americans romanticize crazy. They use it in their idiomatic expressions. Oh, that idea is so crazy, it just might work, right? Uh, a person who's a genius, right, is considered, that one of their attributes would be eccentricity, even though that's not true, right? To qualify, it's like the baseline to qualify to be a genius in America is you have to show madness, some form of eccentricity, right? Lots of crazy people do tend to be, eccentric, right? That's not the case in a place like Nigeria where they're very intelligent people. Intelligent people are normally calm. They do in Nigeria, right? Attributes of an intelligent person, highly intelligent or a genius, right? Yes, we do have geniuses in Nigeria as well. They are not written off or dismissed or mischaracterized as having eccentric traits. But in America, you see that's what happens in America. Geniuses are conflated or mischaracterized as having eccentric traits, right? It's like so you'd find that maybe many people who want to characterize themselves as being very smart or geniuses, they probably are faking eccentric mannerisms, just so they can they can qualify as geniuses. And those who know themselves as geniuses, in order to validate their genius, they probably they go through some kind of affectation and pretense, and pretend that they are crazy, that they have eccentric mannerisms, so they can really validate themselves as geniuses, right? Because not all geniuses are going to accomplish something with their genius, right? But in any event, what I wanted to do was show this country's long affinity with madness, right? This long affinity with madness, and unfortunately, we've normalized it, and um, we don't cringe at what's insane unless it's too late. We don't cringe. We romanticize it. We embrace it. We make it part of our society. And this is one of the perplexing things we're having today with the president, because our president, Donald Trump, he's not acting normal. He acts. It's not new. He's been doing things that are insane. The decapitation of a foreign government, the assassination, all that's happening. It's insane. Recently, thank God, our a fighter pilot that got shot down in the F-15E uh, Strike Eagle, you know, was rescued. All they both of them. The one that was missing in action in Iran, there was a rescue operation. I'll do another video. There's now more speculation that rescue operation, in which the CIA played a very important part, that all of that was probably a ruse or some kind of false flag operation to actually try and retrieve enriched uranium. I don't know, but that's the speculation that's making the rounds in the news today. When I saw on social media, but anyway, I digress. So thank goodness that the pilots were both recovered. They came back and they were within U.S. custody and safe. They were safe in U.S. custody, and nothing, no harm came to them. They didn't fall to the Iranians as prisoners of war. If they had fallen to Iranians as prisoners of war, I'd seen talking heads. They'd already started discussing that. Well, that there's standards that Iranians would have to abide by, international law standards with respect to holding prisoners of war. It would be a war crime, for instance, to torture prisoners of war. Now, that's rich, right? It's rich considering that our government has said to hell with international law, right? It was a violation of international law, violation of jus ad bellum. I've done videos explaining jus ad bellum, justa causa, that you need just cause, justification for war in order to go to war with another nation, right? You act in self-defense, or you're under threat. There was no just cause. There was no justification for going to war. So that was a violation of international law. The way we struck, and then political assassinations are actually against international law. But our government was now saying that no, to hell, we don't abide by the rules of international law. So it's like you see the selective observance, selective adherence to international law when it suits us. So all of a sudden, our combatant is a likely a prisoner of war in Iran, and then we're raising issues of international law, right? Because of the treatment of prisoners of war, it's under international law guidance, right? Because that would be jus in bello. I've done a video discussing jus in bello. That's conduct with during war, how the combatants operate during war, right? So their rules they have to follow, they have to abide by when war has already started, and that is also again within the orbit, the sphere of international law, which our government, our president, has blithely, blatantly disregarded, right? And so, even in his tweets, the threats to actually destroy power plants, civilian infrastructure, attacking civilians, which we've been doing, those are actually international war crimes, right? So, America's conduct of this war has been a massive violation of international war crimes. But we understand that we're now operating in an era when might is right. It's simply might is right. So we're back in the dark ages of medieval times, because that's what's going on right now, right? The United Nations has shown it is just a paper tiger organization. It has no bite. It has no because there are those five powers within this. The Permanent Security Council that have veto power. America is one of them. United Nations, right? They were the Allied forces who won the Second World War. I've done videos discussing this. That's United States is one of them. United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia. It used to be USSR. So Russia. Those five nations have veto power, right? And you can't hold any of those five nations to account. They act arbitrarily. You see, Russia already had waged a war against Ukraine. It violated the sovereignty of Ukraine, and now America is doing its own, waging war. American Israel waging their own war that violates the sovereignty of Iran. So these are crazy things. Before everybody was calling Putin crazy. And I've done a video talking about how will historians write our history? What will they say about us, right? What will they say about Americans in the future, right? Because America's history is going to be written. Uh, we read the history of Nazi Germany and we see how those who write that history, they talk about the Nazis were crazy, they were evil people. What are they going to say of Americans, right? When we read history, they talk about the Greeks being very intelligent, right? They loved, they loved politics. They gave us democracy and all that stuff. What are they going to say about Americans? Americans clearly love war, but are they going to just dismiss Americans as being crazy people? Well, this country romanticizes madness and crazy behavior, right? Things that are just beyond the pale, right? Completely left field. And we don't find it disconcerting or off putting, right? And so our president can just tweet off threats, war crimes. And I mean, coming from a president, I mean, is this new? Well, I don't know why people are clutching their pearls. This is constant normalized behavior. It's baseline standard behavior for our president, for President Donald Trump. He did it as number 45. He's doing it again as number 47. So why are people suddenly clutching their pearls? Like he's acting differently, right? But in any event, what I wanted to do was talk about some things I didn't wasn't able to get to in the earlier video. Um, America has a long history, right? In fact, from our beginning, a long history and an affinity with madness and the way we've treated it from our very foundation, right? When we fought the War of Independence and got our independence from King George III, uh, there was already madness. Surprisingly, the historians do not often cite and put it markedly out there that The King George the Third of Great Britain, whom we got our independence from, whom we went to war against, was actually, in colloquial terms, certifiably insane. King George the Third was crazy, right? He was certifiably insane, but nobody talks about this. People don't refer to this enough. Today, they say what he had, it was bipolar disorder. Again, bipolar disorder, they don't use that term insane anymore, right? It's no longer in use medically because it's gone out of the favor since the 20th century, right? So they use bipolar. They say what he had was bipolar disorder, and maybe the reason why historians don't point this out is because many of our we've had presidents who had bipolar disorder, like they didn't do crazy. I mean, like John Adams. John Adams is one of my favorite presidents. He and his son, in fact, and it runs in their line, right? I think some of the descendants of John Adams actually committed suicide, and was it runs in their line. From their diaries, right? The things they described. John Adams talked about hallucinations and things like that. So people who hallucinate, they see things that others don't see. Apart from if unless they take drugs, right? That is it's endogenous, right? It's responding to internal stimuli. It's a form of madness, right? It's a form of insanity. It's again those terms. Insanity is used as a legal term, not as a clinical term anymore. But so maybe that's a reason why we do not address this, right? Uh, One of in fact, my favorite American president, Abraham Lincoln, was manic depressive. Manic depressive, it's a synonym. Uh, it's the same as synonymous with bipolar disorder. We choose to call it bipolar disorder, but again, they don't use madness. Back then, it would have been called insanity. Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, there wasn't a diagnosis for these things then. They would just say, okay, they're insane. And I guess because these were prominent people, they probably didn't want to put them in a madhouse because that would have been the end of their careers. But it was known, it was understood. And, I guess they couldn't really understand the illness that much. But Teddy Roosevelt, yes, he was had bipolar disorder. His son committed suicide. That's Kermit Roosevelt. Kermit the Roosevelt was the father of Kermit Roosevelt Jr., whom I did a video discussing. He was the one who was in the CIA, who was the father of the CIA orchestrating overthrows of foreign governments, and he was the one who engineered the overthrow of the Prime Minister of Iran in 1953. That's Mohammad Mossadegh, right? So, so we've had presidents who suffered from bipolar disorder. Maybe that's the reason why they sweep this under the rug. And again, as I said, Americans have a tendency to romanticize insanity, right, in our music, in our art, and it might also be because we are the most warfaring nation, right? For over 90% of, not about 97% of, 93% or whatever of our independence, we've been at war. This leaves PTSD, leaves our soldiers suffering from PTSD, and they go back into the community, right? People who fought for the nation's freedoms, you can't suddenly ostracize or alienate them. So you see, we continue to normalize mental disorders, severe mental disorders, things that were called insanity back then. We normalize it in our society as a result of our constant warfaring nature, right? Americans by nature are paranoid. I mean, think about it. The reason why America went to war with Iran, the pretext they initially gave, that Secretary of State Marco Rubio gave, was, well, Israel was going to attack Iran. And he believed, or the leadership, the cabinet, or whatever, whoever authorized the strikes, the president believed uh, Iran would retaliate, and consequently, to preempt Iran's retaliation from being struck, right? America struck first. Before any instance, before Israel hit America, America struck first. So you see, that's delusional, paranoid behavior. So if you can call a nation paranoid, delusional, That's a preemptive strike is one of the things that they do. For a human being to say, well, I anticipated that someone was going to hit me, so I hit him first without any evidence, a preemptive strike, you'd say that person was certifiably insane. You'd say they're paranoid, they're delusional, right? So America's conduct, right, as a nation, right, the way it engages in war, it's not the first time that the American government has waged a preemptive strike, right? That was what George W. Bush did in his war against Saddam Hussein, like in the 2003 invasion, when they lied that there were WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, and they did a preemptive strike. So it's not the first time, right? So paranoia, again, like I said, Americans romanticize madness, insanity, and they don't see it as a problem, right? That insanity is a problem, is a huge problem, and Americans live with insanity. Now you have a very old population that might be very dangerous, and they leave them in leadership, right? Without considering that, well, these people actually are, they're struggling with senility and dementia. I'm not an ageist, but let's look to the facts, right? We all saw how the president unraveled in that debate with Donald Trump in 2024, which of course ended up uh, which meant the presidency effectively went to President Donald Trump, right? We saw, the effects of aging, where it didn't even seem like President Joe Biden was all there. So, aging is and its effects are realities, right? We've been able to use medicine, advanced medicine, to keep people alive longer. It doesn't mean that the things that erode uh, mental acuity will not, will still not be uh, will still not take effect, right? And so these are things the nation is struggling with. But in any event, there was something I wanted to quickly. I wanted to get to a few things. A reason why um, America is sort of deinstitutionalized, right? So we sort of shut down our insane asylums, right? Today, what we have are they call them behavioral health hospitals, and they're normally mixed. They're integrated with the somatic systems, right? Somatic health systems, and they work, together. And they've tried to destigmatize mental illness. Now, there's a major case called um, O'Connor versus Donaldson, 1975 case. And in this case, there was a guy, Kenneth Donaldson, right? He he was diagnosed with uh, paranoid schizophrenia. His parents had been responsible getting him institutionalized, committed in the first place. And He was first diagnosed, I think it was in 1943 when he was around 34 years old. And then later on, and he'd gone to Florida and he started, saying, well, he thought his neighbors were poisoning him. And then his father went to court and they had him committed, right? He went to court, had him committed. And he was, he was committed involuntarily. He didn't want to be in a hospital. So he was committed to Florida State Hospital. He didn't want to be there. He refused treatment. He refused throughout. He never took treatment and he refused, but they put him with people who were severely mentally ill. Eventually, he spent 15 years there and he kept appealing. There were family who wanted him out, but the superintendent, he was the one who was actually called Dr. Connor. He refused, Dr. O'Connor, right? He refused to release him. He refused to release him to his family or his friends. And eventually, the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and uh, Kenneth Donaldson won. And the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice then was Chief Justice Berger, and Donaldson won. They ruled that it was unconstitutional to confine a non-dangerous uh, person who is able to live on his own freely, either on his own or with the support of friends and family. So if they don't want to, so if somebody, even if they have a mental illness, so that was how the standard came to be that you can't just confine somebody because they have a mental illness. They have to be dangerous, right? So if they're non-dangerous, they're able to support themselves or somebody care for them. And if they say they don't want to stay in a mental hospital, in a hospital, they don't want to be confined, the state cannot force them. So it's a violation of the law. So he kept on refusing. At no time did he agree. He never acquiesced. He never took medication. And this went on for 15 years. So he won his court case and he sued as well for damages. They initially awarded him damages, but eventually those damages, then they overturned the damages. But he won and he changed the law. And that was the beginning of deinstitutionalization. Supreme Court said that the state cannot involuntarily confine a non-dangerous person, right? So that's pivotal, and I guess that's why, um, and especially with the rise of the use of antipsychotics, right? There's antipsychotic medication today, that can be prescribed by a doctor, and people can just take them at home. But what's happening is we're having a heavily medicated society, a society that's heavily medicated, and that might be exacerbating the issue as well. By the way, apart from the antipsychotics that the American society is addicted to or heavily dependent on, there's also the substantial addiction to narcotics. Right, many of these narcotics actually induce mental illness. Right, what we call psychosis today. Like marijuana. Marijuana is actually legal in the state of Maryland. I think in DC as well, right? So uh, these things do cause hallucinations. They can induce symptoms of mental illness, and they can be conflated, right? You might say that, well, if somebody doesn't have a mental illness, but they take drugs which make you act like you have a mental illness because you should display symptoms of a mental illness, like hallucinations or paranoia or anxiety, then there's also the issue of we have a large population of people, especially young people, that are being misdiagnosed because they're using drugs, right? In fact, I also learned that, in fact, constant use of uh, the constant use of narcotics, or hard drugs, hard drugs like weed, like LSD, like they call some Maui, like I don't use drugs, so I wouldn't know. But I started investigating these things, um, ecstasy, all these things, right? They have hallucinogenic. They can LSD. I think I mentioned that cocaine. Cocaine can create a sense of euphoria. So delusions of grandiose. Make one feel grandiose. That's what cocaine does. So the constant use of these things can now subsequently cause conditions of mental disorders, right? So not just manifesting the symptoms. Mental disorders like insanity, it has to do with it's endogenous, right? It's from inside you. It's happening because of genetic factors, right? And not we're not saying, well, because of one responding to exogenous or external stimuli, right? Uh, when it's a mental illness is something that's internal going on. Now, when people are constantly abusing drugs, this is what I learned from doctors, psychiatrists, and psychologists. They say, well, this can actually now create a permanent condition of mental illness, real mental illness, that you can now start to hallucinate even without using those drugs, even though you weren't born with a mental illness, but you can now start to show those signs of psychosis, those signs of schizophrenia that accompany the abuse of these illicit drugs. So they're just for young people. I guess young people have to watch out. But this is a problem in America. Um, there was I wanted to discuss something else as well, but I want to try and keep these videos shorter. So I'm going to do a second video, and I'm going to discuss uh, 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 a folk tale. The emperor has new clothes, right? The emperor has new clothes, and I will do that in a subsequent video. My name is Olorotimi Osha. I will keep you posted. Thank you.